कैलाश लाइव स्ट्रीम हो रहा है?
कर रहे ट्राई कर रहे हैं वैसे तो, लेकिन वैसे जूम के थ्रू
जूम से
এটা এখন তো
কিভাবে অপারেট করব
এটা এখন এটা পরেরটাই দেখিয়ে দেবো আপনাকে, এটা এর পরেরটা। ঠিক আছে, ঠিক আছে স্যার, এটা পরেরটা।
May I request the dignitaries to take their seat on the dais? May I please request the dignitaries? Ma'am, you also please.
After this session is over, Professor Bardhan would like to just see how the thing scrolls, how his presentation scrolls. Joydeep, you start.
A very good morning to everyone present here, to our Honorable Director, Professor Satinder Bhatia, to the dignitaries on the dais, our esteemed Chief Guest, Dr. T.C. Anand, our guest of honor, Dr. Ranjit Rath, our invited speakers, Professor Pranab Bardhan and Professor James Markison, my faculty colleagues, members from the administration, our sponsors, Center for WTO Studies, All India Limited, ONGC Videsh, ECGC, Indian Bank, Center for Regional Trade. And last but not the least are dear students. I welcome you all to the 8th edition of the International Conference on Empirical Issues in International Trade and Finance, EIITF, which was first started in the year 2008 as a platform to bring together academics working in the area of economics and finance and the policymakers. This year, we have got an overwhelming response from scholars worldwide, and we have received more than 200 papers, out of which, after a rigorous peer review process, about 100 papers have been selected for presentation. The theme of this year's conference is Emerging Dynamics of Trade and Finance in the Time of Global Disruptions. We begin today's inaugural session with the ceremonial lighting of the lamp. I request all the dignitaries on the dais to kindly light the auspicious lamp. Our economic students Rupali, Anjali, and Sudipa will be assisting the dignitaries in lighting the lamp. Thank you, sirs and ma'ams. May I now request our Director, Professor Satinder Bhatia, to felicitate our Chief Guest, Dr. T.C. Anand, with a small token. May I now request Professor Bhatia to felicitate our guest of honor, Dr. Ranjit Rath. May I now request Professor Neeti Nandini, conference convener, to felicitate our director, Professor Satinder Bhatia. We will now begin today's conference with a welcome address by Professor Satinder Bhatia. Professor Bhatia is a professor of finance and is currently also the Dean IIFT, head of the Center for Distance and Online Education. She has over the past held many responsible and leadership positions at IIFT, steering the institutes towards new direction. As professor of finance, she has taught a wide range of subjects to IIFT, MBA, and executive students. She has also published books on policy impediments to trade and FDI in India and accounting, information and risk assessment. She has won national and international awards for her contributions to the field of accounting and finance. May I now invite Professor Bhatia for the address.
Good morning, everyone. All the dignitaries on the dais and even below. I think I must begin with Professor Manoj Pant first, because he has been our guide, our mentor for the last 5.5 years. And I think all this research conference that is taking place, a lot of it is because of the guidance that he has been giving over the past 5 years. So thank you, sir, for all your contribution to IIFT and particularly to the research that is taking place in the institute. I think for long we will get the benefits of all that you have done over here. So I know that all the participants also, many of you have traveled long distances to come here. So heartiest welcome to this institute. Many of you may be visiting the institute for the very first time. I hope you've had a good experience, whatever little experience there might have been for the moment. But we promise definitely 2 days full of vigor. A lot of research ideas that you're going to carry from here. We are very happy to have 2 professors from US traveling all the way to address us from University of Colorado and Berkeley. So we are very fortunate. This conference on empirical issues in international trade and finance, as you know, is the 8th one. So for last 7 conferences have been held alternately in Delhi and Kolkata, focusing on the relevant issues in trade and finance. So these 2 areas, trade and finance, are so vital today in the world. In fact, both of them are related because we can't think of international trade without international finance. And we see a lot of changes that are taking place in both areas. How one helps the other, how one facilitates the other, that definitely becomes a research issue. And I know there are lots of research papers on both these issues. Since I'm from finance, I know in the area of finance, we are talking about newer entities like fintechs coming up and actually playing a very big role. Sort of disruption has occurred not just in the banking sector, but also in the non-banking sector because of the fintechs. Fintechs are playing a very important role even in international trade because, all these technologies that we have been talking about, blockchain technology, Internet of Things, and nowadays people talk about Internet of Services, all of it is affecting and going to affect international trade in a big way because things that were taking very long, let us say payment processing, which is inevitable in international trade and which somewhat slows down even the enthusiasm of exporters and importers if payments are not cleared on time. All that is likely to change because of easier verification of documents just through the use of technology. Those who have studied international trade know that letter of credit has been a primary means to ensure that payments come on time, but those who have used letters of credit also have seen a lot of problems in the use of letter of credit and of course the other payment mechanisms. Now, if the use of blockchain technology, if the use of even what CBDCs are coming into and how it might affect cross-border payments, everybody is curiously waiting for that. There are some countries that have started using digital currencies as a mode of cross-border payments, which is inevitable in international trade. The Reserve Bank of India has taken huge steps forward, and at least on both wholesale and maybe on retail also, they are experimenting with these currencies. So definitely it is not just the payments within the country, but more importantly, the international payments, how they are going to get affected and how all that will in a way disrupt the payments that go on in international trade. We talk about a lot of volatility in the financial markets, but these new innovations that are coming in also have somewhat of a calming effect on the volatilities that one sees both in the financial markets and even in trade. In trade, we know all geopolitical reasons due to which trade has been getting disrupted. But even in Russia's case, we see that the use of cryptocurrencies did increase at a time when they were facing sanctions. And now, of course, India is trying for rupee trade with many countries. At least more than 35 countries have expressed a desire to have rupee trade with India, and that's a great thing. We are going to be, even if it is a very minuscule way in which there will be internationalization of our currency, I think that might be even less than a baby step, but it is even then a very significant step. So there are significant steps that have to be taken, whether it is in the journey of a country or even in the journey of an institution. So as this institute, this research conference is definitely a forum for initiating baby steps, but now since we are into the 8th conference this year, much bigger steps and actually making a bigger impact on policy making in the area of international trade and finance. The government of India does look for certain important inputs. And I also see my colleagues from Center for WTO Studies over here. And I know Center for WTO Studies, along with the other centers like Center for Trade and Investment Law, and the third center, which was their CRT, the Center for Regional Trade. All these centers are making a significant contribution to policy making by the government of India by providing important inputs. And they truly are think tanks. And therefore, it is definitely a proud moment for IIFT to be, providing to be the think tank for the government, and I would say even the industry, because the consulting for the industry does help a lot in all these issues. So just once again on the volatility, I just feel that with increased research, since it becomes there is increased clarity on the issues, that also helps to contain the abrupt decisions that may be taken from time to time. And since there is a very analyzed way of taking decisions rather than abrupt decisions, then that volatility, you can say, or abruptness in the decision that takes place, that also gets contained because of the research. And IIFT, there has been a huge focus, as I mentioned earlier. We have a very robust PhD program now. More than 30, 40 students take admission every year, and I suppose all of them are here today. So the program itself has undergone various changes, and we definitely see a lot of robustness in the program, a lot of good contributions being made by the PhD students. I would just like to welcome once again all of you. I'm sure we'll have 2 days of very productive ideas, productive discussions, and we shall wait for the outcome of this conference, not just by what we have discussed, but how it results in increased research, not just again by way of publishing, but also the impact that we will be making to both government policy making as well as industry functioning. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for elaborating so nicely on the theme of this year's conference. May I now invite our guest of honor, Dr. Ranjit Rath, Chairman and Managing Director, Oil India Limited, to deliver his address. Dr. Ranjit Rath is an alumnus of IIT Bombay and IIT Kharagpur. Before assuming the charge of Chairman and Managing Director of Oil India Limited, which is India's second largest national exploration and production company, this year in August. A geoscientist with impeccable experience and expertise of more than 25 years in the field of geoscience, Dr. Rath, prior to joining at the head of affairs of OIL, has been Managing Director and CEO of various PSUs working in mining and geology. Dr. Rath has a rich portfolio of diverse role and spanning from strategy formulation, business development, and upstream asset management to application of geoscience and exploration geology in several important projects. May I now request Dr. Rath to please take over.
A warm good morning to each one of you. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, but I must tell there is a further addition, and I feel humbled to be part of this particular conference because I am an alumni of IIFT also. And when you get to share the dais with the Indian teachers and the faculties, you feel very humbled. It feels great, and good to see all the students. Now the formal part, Professor Dr. Anand, Dr. Bhatia, Director EIITF, Dr. Niti Nandini, and Professor Manoj Pant, distinguished economists, and of the dais, faculties of EIITF, my dear students, and ladies and gentlemen. When I was invited to speak in this particular occasion, I was a bit concerned because this is where I learned what is international trade. This is where I was taught what is FOB. This is where I was taught what is CIF. And this is where I was also taught, as Dr. Bhatia told a while ago, what is letter of credit. And I'm also aware of the fact that the content of the research papers which is going to be discussed in the next 2 days are of immense potential and value. And we are having guest lectures of eminent speakers from overseas. Now, giving me a comforting assurance when we discussed at length what should I talk about in the inaugural session, Dr. Niti said, don't worry, you just give an industry perspective. So while I intend to share my industry perspective, I would request the eminent guests here to probably have a discussion on the same, which as an India as an economy is facing, and I'm sure each one of you would be knowing those concerns. But I thought I would share because that is what when we were looking forward to when we were a student here. And I would share those thoughts or insights that we have gathered for my dear students. As part of international trade, what comes to our mind initially is the HS code. And the most important HS code in the country today is 270-910, that is crude oil. We import about 85 to 86% of our crude oil requirement for the country. With a 250 million ton refining capacity, while we consume about 210, 220 million ton for our internal consumption, we also export petroleum products to various geographies. And we take advantage of about 7,500 kilometers of coastline, and we are actually in a very vantage position. Sitting on the left, we have the oil producing countries, and on the right, we have the oil consumption countries. So while we import crude oil, 86% or 85 to 86% of our annual need, we also import LPG. We also import 50% of our natural gas requirement. And we also import ATF. Now, while we import this, we import from a variety of sources. That's about it varies from 29 countries to 39 countries world over. Once upon a time, a country which was importing crude oil is now an exporter of crude oil, that is the United States of India, which is quite far from us, but we receive shipments from USA as well. Now, when we talk about this international trade fair, we are also aware of the fact, the necessity of the understanding as part of the supply chain, the crude carriers. Now, why are we talking about it in this particular opportune moment? Because the conference is actually empirical issues. So as part of this crude procurement strategy, what we do, we acquire assets abroad through oil equity. We invest in exploration assets, we invest in producing assets, and we also have something called farm in and farm out concepts through these equity acquisitions. Now, a while ago, when as part of her opening remark, Director EIITF, Professor Bhatia said, the notion of financing. We all know that on December 5th, a major discussion or a decision was taken, which was primarily a posturing effect. The European Union announced that Russians cannot sell their crude with a maximum market cap of $60 per barrel. If you are importing crude, which India is currently importing the maximum component or the highest component of crude from Russia, we as Oil India has got some assets which are producing. We have invested in oil equity in Russia. But the irony is, even if we are receiving the dividends and 80% of our investment in terms of dividend is already recovered in a span of 4 years, how do we repatriate the funds? There is no mechanism as of now, we are still figuring out. There is a thought process that can we barter this fund which is lying in Russia as part of our oil marketing companies importing crude oil and get paid here. In that particular context, considering that we have got FTA relationship or better cordial relationship, we also create subsidiaries. So we operate our overseas oil equity through our subsidiaries located in either Amsterdam or in Stockholm or in Singapore. Now, you never know which country will actually align with which country during any kind of exigencies, which is otherwise called international Cold War. Your money is struck. So these are those uncertainties on which we have international trade. But then why do we do trade? Because world over, it is always some kind of a balancing effect from an endowed resource-rich countries to a market-driven economy. We also look at seriously the African continent rather, which is hugely endowed with mineral resources. But the dynamics is, how do we source minerals which is ethically procured or extracted or mined? We all have seen many such English films which displays the piteous conditions of the workers. As we are all now enjoying the beautiful game of football through FIFA World Cup, a jersey and the kits, which is available in the market for about $200 US, we must know that it is procured from Myanmar, where a daily worker gets a paltry sum of $2 to $2.5 per day. Now, this is the kind of imbalance which international trade is all about. This is the kind of constraints which international trade is all about. And this is what we must figure out how to answer such questions. Going back to the natural resources, India is still deficient of a serious commodity which is considered currently the hot or the future of fuel, that is lithium. We have two concentrated sources in terms of Latin America, that is Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, for lithium, which occurs in salars, and in Australia, which is primarily hard rock. And in India, we are actually creating or still establishing or looking for import substitution of lithium batteries. So serious research is going on in terms of technology development. Now, such technology development, either we do it within the country or we acquire, are actually a counter measure for ensuring a value chain or a supply chain in terms of international trade. While shipping the lithium salts from far locations of Latin America or shipping it from Australia will give us this advantage, but the point is, where is the value chain in the country? Do we get the salts here and then manufacture and then get into the ions or cations or the battery packs, or we simply import battery packs from China or any other country for that matter? Now, as part of this creation of value chain, even international trade comes into picture. Government of India, as a countermeasure announces, often we know that is called PLIs, production linked incentives. And as we speak, we are hopeful of seeking more such PLIs to create value chain in the country. So what exactly is required is possibly a kind of a resilient mechanism to balance out those volatilities which might happen, you never know, and a resilient mechanism of those uncertainties of shipments, which is actually supposed to come from the eastern coast of USA to the eastern part of the globe, but gets diverted to the western coast of Europe. So with these kind of dynamics, it is extremely important to have such a discourse, and I am looking forward to the excellent insights which we would possibly get as part of this excellent conference and very timely conference. Once again, being a student of EIITF, as an alumni, it feels great. I feel honored, and I must thank you, Professor Nitin Nandini, once again, and the entire faculties with whom I have studied, and I owe this portfolio of mine to this organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rath, for highlighting some of the impediments in international trade which need urgent attention. May I now invite our chief guest, Dr. T.C.A. Anand, who's a member Union Public Service Commission, to deliver the inaugural address. Dr. T.C.A. Anand is currently a member of the UPSC. He was formerly the Chief Statistician of India and Secretary, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Earlier, he had taught at the Delhi School of Economics for more than 2 decades and was also member secretary of ICSSR New Delhi. He has been a member of a number of expert committees of the Government of India. He has served in the academic council or boards of a number of universities and has been a consultant to many international organizations. His area of interest is labor, industry, and economic theory, on which he has published a number of papers and books. May I now request Professor Dr. Anand to please take over.
Good morning, everybody. Let me start by thanking IIFT for calling me here. Professor Bhatia, Professor Chatmani, Dr. Rath, and colleagues of the dais, some of them I'm seeing after many years. I'm grateful to you for having called me here. When I was asked to come and deliver this address, I was a little puzzled as to what am I going to speak. And I've had various hats in different years. So I thought, let me rely on one of my earlier avatars as the Chief Statistician of India, since this is a conference on empirical issues in international trade and finance, and talk a little bit about something which I perceive partly as a small gap in this conference and as an area in which I would like IIFT and the trade theorists to also lend their support to. Many of the papers being presented here, much of the work being done here, relies on data produced by official organizations on international trade and finance. We certainly take a look at the data, when you make use of it, you talk about problems with it, and so on and so forth, which are part of your regular academic exercise. However, what we miss is a focus on the sources of data and the institutional mechanisms from which this data comes to you. I would like, if possible, in future editions of this conference, maybe a session could be devoted on a regular basis to some of these concerns. I wanted to use this forum to talk about this issue and some possibilities which have emerged in recent years, which I would like to use the good offices of IIFT and its parent ministry, the Ministry of Commerce, to help promote. This is partly an issue which I was engaged with in my last few years as the chief statistician. So I thought, it's time to promote this agenda again. To understand the issue, let me first talk about how does international trade data come about. In India, there is a very unique mechanism by which international trade data is produced and disseminated. This is a mechanism which is currently housed in the Ministry of Commerce. It's called the Directorate General of Commercial Intelligence and Statistics. What people may not know, that this is probably one of the oldest statistical offices in India. In fact, other than the census, the colonial rule very early in its period had started gathering state data on trade statistics, because the East India Company and subsequently the British government, which took over the governance of India, were extremely interested in trade statistics. And the office of the Directorate General, or its precursor rather, was set up way back in 1860 to create 62. I don't remember the exact date, to create a system by which trade data could be gathered and disseminated. In more modern times, the data is produced by a very unique partnership which exists between the revenue authorities and the trade administrators, and which are located in the Commerce Ministry. Principally, all exports and imports are of interest to the revenue authorities because of their implications for tax revenue, and therefore there is a body of the revenue system in the customs through which all trade passes. So every item which is either imported or exported goes through Indian customs and files bills of entry or shipping bills, if they are exporting it, with the customs authority, making payments for whatever their liabilities or dues are as per the governing laws of the land. These bills which they file with the customs authority have a lot of commercially valuable and confidential information as well. A unique collaborative arrangement is worked out by the customs authority and the Ministry of Commerce, which is interested in statistics and trade, to allow the sharing of this information to permit the Directorate General of Commercial Intelligence and Statistics to produce from the data gathered at Indian ports the regular trade statistics which we make use of in the analysis which we do. Now, the unique thing about it is that the DGCIS has, through a computer bridge, access to the disaggregated shipping and import bills which are filed by all trade establishments, and therefore can produce in a very timely manner highly disaggregated statistics of international trade, giving both sources of origin and some details about the users for which the trade is taking place. This becomes the basis from which trade statistics is disseminated. Over the years, these trade statistics have become extremely timely because better use of computers have meant that, in fact, we are getting our trade balance with a lag of almost less than a month in most major trade commodities and so on, and for pretty much everything within a couple of months, because the process of collection from some of the ports is still manual, and fairly accurate statistics are disseminated. I'm not going to get into the problems of interpreting trade statistics, and there are academic papers which many of you are working on, some of which are all features in this conference and others, about how to make sense of trade data and so on. So this data has a problem. Its problem is it is limited only to what is available at the port of entry or exit, and the information which is filed by the importer or exporter about the goods which he's sending in and out. To get a proper understanding of trade, we need to follow these goods back from the port to the place of origin or use to be able to get a better understanding of what the goods are going to do. And in some cases now, particularly for example with services, we have a whole bunch of items of import and export which never pass through ports. They're directly traded on the internet. And therefore, the old style trade statistics don't help you very much in getting a handle on this. This has been a problem with doing empirical work in international trade. These gaps have been talked about. In recent years, India has evolved another important, innovation in the field of revenue, which is the goods and services tax. The goods and services tax, for its own purposes, collects detailed information on the production of every good and service in the country, and in fact, also gets information about where that item is sold, based on which the taxes are paid and so on and so forth. This is a highly disaggregated database which is maintained by the revenue authorities. I think it is time for us to ask for a similar innovative collaborative arrangement to be made between the revenue authorities and in the Commerce Ministry, which is principally interested in the area of trade, for sharing of data, ensuring, of course, all forms of commercial confidentiality, which DGCIS has, to its credit, been doing for the last 100+ years. One possibility is to entrust the same task to DGCIS. Another possibility is to create another vehicle like DGCIS, primarily located in the Ministry of Commerce, because they're the ones who are interested in trade, harnessing the GST data and combining it with trade data to provide a much more integrated, disaggregated data, permitting you to understand the production and use of goods from the trade side. I'm using this opportunity of this conference to press both IIFT and its parent ministry to start looking a little more closely at the institutional mechanisms from which data is produced and give support to the statistical establishment so that innovations in data collection can be used to do better research. I hope my message will get across. I would like to thank IIFT for having called me. I feel embarrassed speaking here because many of the people are much better experts in the area of trade. So I thought I'll stick with something in which I have a limited expertise in and use this as an opportunity to talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anand, for a detailed analysis of trade statistics and what more needs to be done with the statistics to make it more useful. Now, I would invite Professor Niti Nandini Chatnani, who's the conference convener, for delivering the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Bardhan. Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Conference Secretariat of EIITF 2022, it is my pleasure to thank our chief guest, Dr. T.C. Anand, and a guest of honor, Dr. Ranjit Rath, for taking out the time to be here to inaugurate the conference and for their valuable insights on some of the most contemporary issues for research in international trade and finance. I also thank our director, Dr. Satendra Bhatia, and our past director, Professor Manoj Pant, for their constant guidance and support in planning this conference and bringing it to fruition today. IIFT and EIITF are pleased to have our distinguished speakers, Professor Pranab, Bardhan, and Dr. James Markison, here for the conference. I'm grateful to them for coming to IIFT and deliver their special lectures, and we look forward to attending their sessions. I express sincere gratitude to all the conference sponsors for their generous support to our endeavor. Thank you, Export Credit and Guarantee Corporation, ONGC Videsh Limited, Oil India Limited, Center for WTO Studies, Center for Regional Trade, and Indian Bank. I'm happy and proud to mention that this conference has received support from IIFT alumni placed in senior positions in large corporates, and I'm grateful to our alumni for this. I also thank the Center for WTO Studies and the University of Western Australia for partnering with IFT in the two policy forums that we have scheduled over the 2 days of this conference. I must thank all my faculty colleagues for their contribution in various roles to this conference and for their valued participation today. I'm grateful to the registrar for his support for the conference and to all my colleagues from administration and from the computer center for the constant backing provided by them at every step. The conference has received very hearty participation from academicians and researchers from institutions within and outside India, and I'm grateful to each one of them for the papers they've submitted for presentation in the 16 technical sessions that are planned for the 2 days of the conference. I'm also very grateful to the students of IFT who have very enthusiastically supported the conference at every step and here today on the stage and so many roles helping us. And in the end, I must express special gratitude to the diligent and enthusiastic team from the Economics Division. Thank you for their untiring efforts to making the organization of this conference possible. They have meticulously taken care of every little detail, and we could simply not have been here today without their support. Let me conclude now with thanking IFT for providing us this platform to host a conference like EIITF, which has become an important academic event in the calendar of researchers in the international trade and finance domain. Thank you. So please remain seated for the special lecture which will begin in 5 minutes. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much, Pranab. Those were really important insights. I've noted them and I assure you.
That would be nice. Would be very useful. Your parents should also be very
कर दिया ना मैंने कर दिया
हो गया।
इसी वो कर दो बस मिनिमाइज और होगा नहीं इससे ज्यादा नहीं वैसे गायब नहीं तो वैसे तो नहीं होता है नीचे रख देता हूं नीचे रख दो पीपीटी पर ठीक है
एक लाइव हो रहा है।
हाँ वो लाइव हो रहा है पीपीटी बंद कर दो
ये प्रोजेक्शन बंद हो रहा है।
प्रोजेक्शन दूंगा ना मैं नहीं उससे कोई देना नहीं
पीपीटी तो वो यूज करेंगे ना।
अरे अभी नहीं दिखाना नहीं है ना ऊपर करो स्क्रीन शेयर नहीं किया है मैंने स्क्रीन शेयर नहीं है इनको भी नहीं दिखाना है इसीलिए तो हटाया नहीं
इनको दिखाना नहीं।
अभी नहीं दिखाना था वो यूज करेंगे अरे
आप इधर रहो थोड़ा सा ठीक है कोई भी। हाँ I welcome you once again to the first special lecture for this year's conference. The special lecture will be delivered by Professor Pranab Bardhan, who is affiliated to University of California, Barkeley, USA. The session in charge for this current session is Professor Shugata Majid. Professor Majid is the former Vice Chancellor of University of Calcutta and currently the first distinguished professor at Indian Institute of Foreign Trade and project director of Center for Training and Research in Public Finance and Policy, Government of India. He is a PhD at the University of Rochester and currently the editor of South Asian Journal of Macroeconomics and Public Finance. He has published more than 150 papers in reputed journals. His current areas of research are political economy and informal credit market, bench fund theory, trade models, education, and underemployment. So today's speaker, Professor Pranab Bardhan, is a distinguished professor emeritus of economics at the Department of Economics at the University of California, Barkeley. He has done theoretical and field study research on rural institutions in poor countries, on political economy of development policies, and on international trade. A part of his work is in the interdisciplinary area of economics, political science, and social anthropology. He was chief editor of the Journal of Development Economics for quite a long time. He was the co-chair of the MacArthur Foundation funded network on the effects of inequality on economic performance for the year 1996 to 2007. He has also contributed essays to popular outlets like New York Times, Scientific American, Financial Times, etc., apart from many research papers that he has published in reputed journals. May I request Professor Majid to take over, please?
Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guests, teachers, students, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great occasion for us to welcome Professor Bardhan to give a talk on reflections on consequences of trade policy, especially reference to India. I believe that this is a time when we can call Professor Bardhan the teacher of teachers, master of masters, and so on. We grew up reading his various work. As an undergraduate student, I remember in the same college that Professor Bardhan also went to, we used to read about his work on various aspects of development, particularly in agrarian development issues. But you should remember that Professor Bardhan's PhD thesis was on international trade. And in fact, after a brilliant career in India, he moved to Cambridge and his PhD in the 60s on international trade and various aspects of dynamic models, particularly vintage capital models, etc. Then he, of course, delved into development economics, and he was chief editor of Development Journal of Development Economics. And it's a good place for me to put on record my gratitude to him, because early in my career, I could get the opportunity of publishing quite a few articles in that journal. And Professor Bardhan is a teacher of Professor Manoj Pant. So it's great to actually welcome what I should call great-grand teacher. Professor Bardhan is a remarkable academic, very versatile, and those who can just browse through his CV, you will see that he has very keen interest on Indian policy making as a part of his interest in development economics. And I am really very happy to hear from Pranab a lecture on which is related to international economic policy, because most of the lectures that I have heard from him, and I had the occasion of being present there, you talk more about political economy of development. So welcome, and please start your proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Sugato, for those generous remarks. Thank you, Sugato, for those generous remarks. And I'm very glad to be here today, and I'm grateful to the Institute of Foreign Trade for this invitation to me in this special lecture. And thank you all for coming to listen to me. I know it's particularly hard. It's been hard for me last night. I was awake until 2:30, at least, watching the game between France and Morocco. And I'm sure there are fellow sleep-deprived ones in the audience. Let me now go to I have some slides, but they're not in PPT, but they're in PDF. So let me start with some qualifying comments about my talk today. First is about the style. As I said, I'm going to use some PPT and essentially go from line to line in the text. Bear with me. And the other qualifying comment I want to make is that I'm not going to present any new quantitative research, but essentially I'll be doing a kind of overview of recent literature in trade policy, which has some bearings on problems in India, with Indian trade policy. So these are mostly in the form of reflections, and I will have, at every step, I'm going to talk about suggestions about needed research in India. And that is also related to some data issues. DC Anand pointed some data issues. I'm going to go back to that issue, the question of requisite data for Indian trade problems. So let me start with the obvious policy issue of trade liberalization. And I'm going to talk about both on the export side and the import side. In the trade literature, in the last 2 decades, there's been a great deal of reorientation to models where farms are heterogeneous in terms of productivity. There are high productivity farms, low productivity farms, and there are fixed in the Mellitz model, which is one of the landmarks in this literature, Mellitz in Econometrica 2003. There are fixed costs of exporting, and therefore not all the low productivity farms quite often do not make it. So there's a difference in terms of trade performance of farms of different productivity. Let me just refer to one recent empirical piece of work in this area, McCaig and Papchnik, who show for Vietnam that the removal of trade barriers in the US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement benefited mainly large farms in exports, because large farms can overcome the fixed costs of exporting. Fixed costs of exporting can be quite large. And low productivity farms cannot clear that barrier. And this is empirically shown in that paper on US-Vietnam trade. In India, of course, we know MSMEs, the micro and small and medium enterprises, contribute a large fraction of exports. But policies needed to help them in overcoming the large fixed costs are very important. And what kind of fixed costs? Particularly developing branding, marketing network, etc. But there are also important variable costs that are biased against small farms, like access to credit for, say, trade finance. In general, it is of some concern that the fraction of unskilled labor-intensive industries in India's total merchandise exports declined, instead of increasing, declined by almost half in the first 2 decades of this century. And this in a situation of unemployment and underemployment, that's certainly a matter of great concern that unskilled labor-intensive industries' contribution in Indian exports have declined substantially. Going back to the fixed cost issue and other similar issues, Banerjee and Duflo, in their study of Indian software firms, emphasize the importance of reputation effects in long-term contracts. This is also very important in not so much the unskilled labor-intensive, but skilled labor-intensive industries. Reputation issues are extremely important. In fact, as you know, this has hit newspapers as well, newspapers are news items as well. There have been some questions recently raised about quality control in the Indian supply chain for exports of drugs, which have serious reputational effects. You know about the problems with the Ranbaxy Drug International, and most recently, you know of the story about people in Africa had some deaths from the cough syrups which were exported by India. So this has, even a small incident creates a large reputational ripple effect, which I think India has to be very, very careful about in the issue of international trade. I recently, not very recently, 2013, Mukherjee and Sumagari did a theoretical paper which is published in the American Economic Journal Applied Microeconomic Theory. We examined theoretically the importance of middleman margins, and which take a large fraction of the gains of exporters. These margins also are related to the reputational rents of some marketers. So a large part of the small farms, even those who are successful in export market, a significant part of that their rent is taken off by the middlemen, because the small farms by themselves don't have the reputation to sell. So these are all part of the fixed costs of exporting. Small sellers in developing countries have to pay these rents in a highly imperfect market, pay these rents to the middlemen. We need more empirical studies. Unfortunately, I looked for some empirical studies, and I could not find many empirical studies of measures of such reputational rents and ways of lowering the burden for small sellers. Let me now come to the import side. There have been quite a few detailed econometric studies of the effects of Indian trade liberalization of the 1990s on manufacturing productivity. I cite here some of the important papers. The first one, Goldberg, Khandelwal, Papchinik, and Topalova. The two papers, then Topalova and Khandelwal. And the third paper, you may not be familiar with. I want to tell you about it. I myself was involved in it in a way. I'll tell you. This is Shanti Nataraj, whose paper was published in Journal of International Economics. Now, something to note here, I've cited quite a few authors in this line, except for Khandelwal, all the others, I'm happy to note, are women. Two major channels in this literature, there are two major channels in effects of trade liberalization on productivity. One is the pro-competitive effect, theoretically emphasized in the Melitz type literature of farms, where, as I said, it's a heterogeneous farm model in which different farms have different productivity. In that context, trade liberalization has a pro-competitive effect, giving an advantage to high productivity farms. And the other channel is the better, cheaper, and larger variety of imported inputs. This is theoretically emphasized in the literature on trade and endogenous growth. In fact, quantitatively, this is the more important channel, in fact, more important than the pro-competitive effect channel, often ignored by Indian policymakers who emphasize autarky or self-reliance. This has now become more important in view of the increasing complexity and fine-grained nature of the global value chain, in which India's participation has been rather weak compared to some other countries, developing countries. Actually, the more advanced the technology, usually the more important is the extent of interdependence on a whole host of inputs and components from different countries. Just to give you a recent important example, mRNA vaccines, for example, have more than 100 components worldwide. So the whole global value chain plays an important role, and there, at every stage, imported inputs. So the effect of trade policy on imported inputs is a crucial one. And in terms of empirical research, I would say within India, as GST, which is goods and services tax data, on farm-to-farm transactions become available, they're not fully available as yet, but soon they should be available. The empirical work on the role of traded and non-traded inputs can be substantially improved. There should be a whole host of data soon to be available from the GST data. And that trade economists should be able to use it in their empirical work to throw light on the role of traded and non-traded inputs. One problem that we have to be careful about in econometric work is that when you are discussing the effect of trade liberalization on productivity, etc., we have to make sure that the policy itself is exogenous, because otherwise, obviously, there'll be what are called endogeneity problem in the econometric literature. So that you have to make sure that the policy is exogenous. In fact, I think there is some evidence that in the 90s, in the early 90s reforms, trade reforms, probably it is correct to say much of that policy change was exogenous. I cite this paper, Topalova and Khandelwal, shows statistically that in the period 92 to 96, the tariff reduction policies of the government were not influenced by industry characteristics involving industry lobbying efforts or the government trying to protect particular, say, less efficient industries, etc. So it's reasonable to suppose that the trade liberalization episode from this kind of empirical work was relatively exogenous. So Topalova and Khandelwal show that farm total factor productivity significantly goes up with reduction in output tariffs and reduction in effective rates of protection. But one thing that is often not noticed, that much of this work use prowess database of CMIE, Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy data, of manufacturing companies. This data is biased in favor of relatively large companies. Those of you who have used prowess data know the limitation of the prowess data is largely confined to relatively large companies. So it does not capture the majority of Indian companies. Much of the work on the effects of trade liberalization and productivity ignores that the Indian manufacturing sector, like much of the rest of the economy, is overwhelmingly informal. The median manufacturing firm in India has only 2 employees. So they're not merely small, they're very, very small. Here, the work by Shanti Notaraj that I mentioned becomes important. Shanti was my student in Barkeley. She did her PhD on, and then published the Journal of International Economics paper on the effect of Indian trade liberalization on productivity. And something came out of that research that I want to focus on. What she did, unlike others, as I already told you, that much of the work uses prowess data, which is for large companies. But even if you take small companies, relatively small companies, some people use the ASI data, which are annual survey of industries data, but annual survey of industries data mostly of formal sector firms. What Shanti did, she combined ASI data, which is annual survey of industries, formal sector data, with national sample survey, come out, I think every 5 years or so, household enterprises, or sometimes they call it unincorporated enterprises. So that's to a large extent, that is for the informal sector. And Shanti, for the first time in this literature, combined the formal and the informal. And what did she find? She found that average productivity in the manufacturing sector did go up with tariff reduction of the 1990s. But what was the process? The process was mainly through elimination of low productivity informal firms. The average productivity in manufacturing went up because low productivity informal firms got wiped out. That was the main mechanism through which this happened. So this is the Melitz type pro-competitive effect I mentioned earlier. So I remember asking Shanti, so you show that the low productivity informal firms got wiped out. Then I asked her, where did the employers and employees in the wiped out informal firms go? She said, of course, her data didn't show anything about that. I said, my guess is that they went out, they got wiped out, and they went and crowded the non-traded of an informal services sector. Those who lost their small farms, tiny farms, they went and crowded the non-traded, often informal service sector. If so, if that is correct, if my guess is correct, then the average productivity in the non-traded sector may have gone down because all these people went and crowded that sector. And if that is the case, so even if trade liberalization may have improved average productivity in the manufacturing sector, it may not have necessarily improved the average productivity of the economy as a whole when you take manufacture and service, including informal. So that is something underemphasized in the literature. Nataraj correctly pointed out to me that the Indian data did not allow her to test my guess. So that tells you about a major deficiency of Indian data. Enterprise level survey data like ASI or NSS are not linked with their employees in the household survey data. So for example, NSS from time to time will give you unorganized sector farm data. NSS also collects household consumer. NSS also collects household labor data, but they're not integrated. So you cannot trace from one survey to the other. This is, I think, a major deficiency of Indian data to do really substantial empirical work in this field. Ideally, we need integrated consumer, enterprise, and labor service. NSS does all the three, but they're not integrated. So it's not the same farm. So with some effort, this could be done, but it's not done. All these years, it's not been done. One of my Brazilian students told me that Brazilian data are somewhat better in this respect, where you have integrated employer-employee data. So if an employee loses a job, then you can follow her to where did she go. Brazilian data allows you, but not Indian data. So a recent paper by these 4 authors that I mentioned here, I think it's still it's an NBER working paper. It may not have yet been published. It uses Brazilian data from formal and informal farm survey and household survey that becomes relevant for what kind of things we could do, but we don't do in India. Let me mention a couple of results from that Brazilian work. Trade openness unambiguously decreases informality in the tradable sector in Brazil, but has ambiguous effects on aggregate informality. This, you must see, is consistent with my guess that I gave to Nazma, that informal sector may decline in manufacturing, but then they go and crowd the informal sector elsewhere, so aggregate informality may not decline. And the other finding in their paper, the informal sector works as an unemployment buffer. We all know that. Namely, those who lose jobs, they will starve otherwise. So they do and scrounge and do something in the informal sector. So it's an unemployment buffer, but at low productivity. But in the Brazilian case, their data show trade openness increases on balance real income for the economy as a whole. This may or may not hold in the Indian economy, where the informal sector is much larger than in Brazil. The proportion of informal workers in Brazil is about 48%. In India, it's almost double that. It's about 90%. Percentage of informal workers, about 90%. Even if you take out the agricultural sector, in India, the proportion of informal workers is more like 80%. So it's very much larger than in Brazil. I'd like to do similar kind of work I'd like people to do this kind of work like what they have done for Brazil, for India, but we don't have the data at the moment. The requisite data need to be collected. Even one elementary piece of information, I have asked many people, no information on that in India. So if you take the informal sector, we all know the informal sector is very large. I asked people, including some economic statisticians in India, tell me, informal workers say 90% in India. Tell me what part of these workers are in those informal enterprises which are in some kind of supply relationship with formal sector. Why is that important? If the formal sector gains, these people being in the supply chain will also gain. So formal will pull up the informal. And then there are others who are just there, just in the informal sector because they have nowhere else to go. They're just scrounging around at a very low level of productivity. So I've asked many people, tell me what proportion of the informal sector are in a supply relationship with the formal sector and what proportion are just scrounging around. Or I'm just generally describing it, you can give more technical name. Nobody has a clue. And this is the most part of our economy. Nobody has a clue about this division between the supplier relationship with the formal sector and the part of the informal sector, which probably is larger, where there is no supplier relationship. So this even elementary piece of information we don't have. Another interesting difference with Brazil and other Latin American countries is that there, the informal firms are often illegal. Some of them exist mainly to avoid taxes and regulations. In India, while such avoidance is not absent, most informal firms are not illegal. They're often too poor to be above the exemption limit for taxes and regulations. So it's a qualitative difference between the Latin American type of informality and the Indian type of informality. I guess the Indian type of informality is also the case in sub-Saharan Africa. Apart from informality, other factors that may limit the gains from trade liberalization are, and this is obvious, infrastructure, poor state of infrastructure and logistics, market rigidities, immobility of labor. Even in the United States, now economists are finding out the actual extent of immobility in response to policy change. This surprised many researchers, particularly after the recent, what is called the China shock to American manufacturing. How immobile, US is supposed to be the country of high mobility, even there, the actual extent of immobility is quite surprising. Topalova, in some work, has shown that rural districts in India, where employment was concentrated in sectors exposed to large reductions in tariffs, experience substantially less poverty reduction than in relatively unexposed rural districts. She attributes this to labor immobility and labor market rigidities. I have not seen much more work since Topalova's work on this issue. I would presume that the situation may have improved in this respect, because over time, market integration has been improving a great deal in India. So those limiting factors of immobility and rigidity will diminish, though will remain substantial for quite some time. In the US and Europe, there is now quite a bit of empirical literature on industrial decline, mainly due to import penetration and the China shock. And this has been connected with politics and its link with support for right-wing parties. In the US, the most well-known work on this is by Othor, Dorn, Hanson, and Mazzilesi. In Europe, Colantoni and Stanik show that regions adversely affected by Chinese imports are less supportive of democratic institutions and less likely to hold liberal values. In India, such work needs to be done, though trade policy is usually less salient here in local politics. Let me end with some general comments. I've talked about the export side, the import side, but I'll now make some general comments on the recent changes in industrial policy in India with productivity-linked incentives, already that has been referred to in the earlier session, and the policy of limited engagement with trade agreements, preferential or regional. For many decades, I have been, in general, a supporter of the idea of industrial policy, mostly in its theoretical form. In fact, Shugata referred to my PhD thesis. One chapter in the thesis was on industrial policy related to the infant industry argument. But that's theory. I skip some healthy skepticism about the implementation of industrial policy by a heavy-handed bureaucracy. First of all, the industries need to be more carefully selected. Many of the industries currently chosen to be under PLI, the production-linked incentives, are highly capital and skill-intensive. So the goal of job creation will not be met. Even in Japan and South Korea, where industrial policy has been otherwise successful, it has often mainly helped large firms. But for creating jobs, large firms are okay, but those large firms have to be labor-intensive firms. In the PLI, many sectors are not labor-intensive. And of course, also the small and medium-scale firms. Some people say, okay, PLI is not just for growth or job creation. National security is involved. Sure, in fact, even Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations considered national security an important aspect that trade economists should pay attention to. But I think even with national security goal, the plan of giving a 50% subsidy amounting to about $10 billion to Vedanta Foxconn for fabricating chips is difficult to justify. Processing silicon downstream would have been more consistent with India's productive capacity and would have also created more jobs. Even the United States, for many years until recently, has concentrated more on chip design than on fabrication of advanced chips. They've mainly left it to Korea, Samsung, and TSMC, the Taiwanese company, and mostly concentrated until very recently, until the new CHIPS Act, on chip design. In policy implementation, one has to be vigilant in monitoring the performance of the target farms and be strict with non-performing farms, and if necessary, withdraw support from them. Like venture capitalists in the private sector, monitoring startup farms, they support and withdrawing startup farms they support and withdrawing support when necessary. Officials have to play the role of venture bureaucrats. This is a term that's been used by The Economist magazine recently. This often requires making an extra effort to go beyond the traditional hidebound bureaucratic culture in India. one has to be particularly careful in disciplining the farms that are being supported, lest they become white elephants or crony corporates are subsidized to go into new lines of business. They would have gone anyway. So why do you spend taxpayer money for that? Or they acquire too much market power. So these are dangers that one has to be constantly be vigilant about. Government subsidization should be conditional on social goals like creation of productive jobs and abatement of environmental damage or abatement of corporate concentration. And I think the current policy is not sufficiently aware of these necessities. In East Asia and recent history, South Korea and Taiwan used the discipline of success in export markets in prodding the firms supported by their industrial policy to keep to international standards of quality and cost consciousness. It's a policy of stick and carrot. The stick of export market discipline, if you cannot export, then you have to go, and the carrot of generous credit subsidies. Now let me cite some empirical evidence on industrial policy. The empirical evidence generally shows that it succeeds more when it is oriented to the discipline of market competition. So for example, 2015, there is this article by Aguillon and co-authors, which uses Chinese data. Because China has also used industrial policy in a big way. So this paper cites panel data from medium and large Chinese enterprises over 1998 to 2007 to show that industrial policies targeted to competitive sectors or sectors that foster competition, say policies that are more dispersed across firms in a sector, or measures that encourage younger and more productive enterprises in a sector, increase productivity growth. So not all kinds of industrial policy, but industrial policies oriented to competitive sectors. In a survey paper, in discussing industrial policy, my two Berkeley colleagues, Anne Harrison and Andres Rodriguez-Clare, have recommended a whole range of soft industrial policies, not incompatible with WTO regulations, like encouraging R&D, extension services, vocational training, supporting collective action for self-help in business clusters, improving regulations and infrastructure, and so on. In all this, the goal is to develop domestic policies of coordination that improve productivity more than interventions that distort policies. And these soft industrial policies need to be customized to local decentralized contexts, particularly when you want to help small and medium-sized firms. Unfortunately, Indian politicians and bureaucracy are more comfortable with the top-down centralized policies rather than these kind of contextualized, decentralized policies. Nevertheless, to me, it is very important to state one objection that is often made for industrial policy: oh, you have to pick winners, and the government is bad at picking winners. This is a standard objection. I find this rather misleading. Here, I endorse the following statement made by Danny Roderick recently, and I quote, "In the presence of uncertainty, it is inevitable that some projects backed by the government will fail. In this respect, the government is no different from the private sector. The relevant question is whether enough of the projects backed by the government will succeed and produce the social surplus to pay for the failures and more. And there is another relevant question is, of course, that if the government will have the ability to withstand pressure from the concerned lobby to prolong a failed project, and this is where many countries fail in the context of industrial policy. I will now, let me just mention something else about green industrial policy. There's a whole United Nations publication on green industrial policy, which I want to bring to your attention. This document suggests many examples of new green products and service, not just in manufacturing, but also in service sector opportunities that have a great deal of job creating potential. Apart from renewable energy technologies, solar, wind, and geothermal power, both in generation and storage of renewable energy, the focus needs to be on examples like bioplastics, decentralized miniature electric grids, technologies of drip irrigation and rainfall harvesting, the reinforcement of sea walls, green energy powered three-wheeler public transportation, and so on. My last comment is on regional trade agreements. I'll be very brief here. I'm just going to restate something that a lot of other economists have made in India. I do not understand India's reluctance to join RCEP, except as yielding to some domestic business lobbies and exaggerated fear of competition from China. Vietnam, until recently, was a poorer country than India, no longer, but until recently was a poorer country than India, and yet has been much more open to trade agreements. Fear of China is surely not a factor in deciding not to join the trade pillar of IPF, of which China is not a member, or even CPTPP, where China has applied for it, probably will not be granted, where China is not yet a member. India is denying itself the opportunity of participating in regional global value chain hubs. And this brings out a special feature of Indian capitalism. In general, India's corporate giants are much too oriented to domestic non-traded sectors or sectors that are more dependent on government regulatory favors. This does not speak well for our capitalism being dynamic. That's where I'm going to end. You might consider it as some rambling comments on different aspects of trade policy. I hope some of this have been useful to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bardhan, for a very thought-provoking talk. Just, we open up this forum now for some question and answers, but one, comment I would like to make on the last point that Professor Bardhan said, because I just gave a lecture a few weeks ago, or maybe last month, to train a bunch of bureaucrats for the forthcoming FTA negotiations of Government of India, and Ministry of Commerce invited me to do that. One point that I asked this question, that why India was so keen on getting into this kind of FTAs, bilateral negotiations, and one comment which I think would be relevant from Professor Bardhan's perspective was that inevitably the government spokespersons or whoever were talking about India's past experience with the regional trade agreements, that now what they argue is that there is substantial evidence that the promised benefits from earlier negotiations have not been derived. So one of the reasons that why government was not very keen on regional trade agreements and focusing on one-to-one negotiation is that they think that the benefits that were written down that India should receive at the end of the day, somehow, that's not forthcoming. So, but this is not my research, so I cannot just vouch for the government of India. But that's one point that we raised. Anyway, now the floor is open for questions. We'll have a few questions and Papi will actually comment. Okay, thank you.
The volunteers, can you please move around with the mics? So there's someone at the end. Oh, and
Sir, thank you for meeting is so simple that my question is that you have said that the informal sector productivity we have gone up when I would say in the formal sector we increase the productivity from Professor Shanti's paper. Now, could it be possible that in the informal sector, the process of production may be different than in the formal sector, and maybe people joining from the formal sector to the informal sector may help the informal sector because sometimes they bring the best practices of the formal sector.
so would you like to collect more questions and then okay. So any more questions, please raise your hand. Oh, yeah. So please use the microphone.
All our life through the gravity model, we were taught that larger the distance, lower the trade, larger the size, larger the trade. Now these new trade models that you talk about, they also talk about that larger the distance, larger the trade, larger the size, lower the trade. And probably we are talking about market conditions, we're talking about firm heterogeneity. But there is some clarification which is required, especially why is it that larger the distance, larger the trade, maybe quality matters.
Yeah, extension towards certain extent. So if we are talking about geography, so it's something like India and for example, if it's Kolkata is more nearer to Bangladesh than Delhi. So I'm talking about geography, then how does that, how do you account for this?
So, Professor Pant has a question, if you can.
One comment on something long back in 2006, I did some work published in EIITF. We showed the problem of the missing will. The problem of the missing will, which I did in 2006 paper. And subsequently, in relation to what you mentioned about merits that I work on, large firms are going to export because they are more productive and they can bear fixed cost export. But the reality in India is that at least even after 91, the firms that are exporting are the small firms. We all know that 40% of trade is small firms. Now, would it be fair to say that if you open up competition, over time, hopefully, the larger firms will be induced to go in for trade because of greater competition. And this would help the smaller firms as they are linked to the larger firms. Therefore, your missing middle problem may exactly be the problem of the protection of this trend.
So if you would respond to the questions.
Thank you for those questions. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all of them. One is that Shivata mentioned about the government, some bureaucrats think that not enough benefits have come from these agreements. I'm sure that is possible in some cases, but then I think then research should be oriented. If that is the case, if that is confirmed by more empirical work, then the question then is, why is it Vietnam is so key? Why does it work for Vietnam, not for us? I think that's where the question should be redirected. I'm quite sensitive to this piece of information. It needs to be empirically confirmed, and then the question should be redirected. Why some other countries, even Bangladesh, seems to be much more successful in some respects. Second question is about the best practices of so they may bring best practices to the informal sector. That's certainly possible, but in the Shanti Nautara's work that I referred to is the informal sectors that got wiped out with a very low productivity firms. So it is possible that when they joined, and in fact they went out of manufacturing sector altogether. Most of them went and crowded the informal service sector. And so it is possible that they could break best practices there. But if you ask me, it's unlikely because they were wiped out from the manufacturing sector because their productivity was so low. It's unlikely that they will then improve the practices in the informal sector. It's possible, but in my judgment, less likely. On the gravity model issue, of course, gravity model emphasizes one aspect in terms of distance, the transportation cost, and the other is size. The other models emphasize other aspects, so I think one has to really put emphasis in all these factors. Quality that you mentioned is very important, but also in terms of there's a trade-off between distance, transportation sector. Of course, transportation sector over time is declining. So over time, the distance factor may be less important. But on the other hand, as somebody said, geography is history now. But the important about the issue is the trade-off of that with size. Is size because it's related to economies of scale. And different industries, different sectors have differential importance of economies of scale. And I think the answer will therefore vary from sector to sector. Manoj's question about large farms. I think there is and I already mentioned that MSMEs play a very important role in Indian exports. But I think there's a trade-off there. If you look at the East Asian cases, as I mentioned, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, in exports, the successful farms were large farms. But the important factor is that at the time, in Korea's case, from the 60s onwards, Taiwan's case a little later, and China much later. These large farms that are successful created jobs because they are also labor intensive. Our large farms are not quite often labor intensive. So I think that's where the major difference is. Otherwise, large farms have the advantage of economies of scale, which improves productivity. So we have this problem. Most of our farms are small, and therefore they cannot have the scale economies that lowers the productivity. On the other hand, large farms, which have economies of scale, they are not in the labor intensive sectors. They need to be, and the disadvantage informal is that they have to pay higher wages and higher things. So there are trade-offs between these different types of factors. I have a feeling, in fact, even if you look on even poorer country, Bangladesh, the garment industry forms a successful and large cost, but large labor-intensive cost. I don't think they will succeed so much in other sectors because the garment industry is a labor-intensive sector. I think it is therefore the answer, what you pointed out is very correct, but I think the answer will depend on all these different factors combined. Let me stop.
Thank you, Professor Bardhan. We have come to the almost to the end of the session. Just before we break up, I would draw your attention to one of Professor Bardhan's earlier work on the political economy of India. Professor Bardhan wrote a very, very impressive, persuasive, and thought-provoking book on which he talked about, in those days, the type of class configurations as to why development gets stuck. That is interesting. And it is also interesting to note that we learned so much in development textbooks and from the basic economic theory and principles. I always ask this question: why the governments never pursue first-based policy? I think one point that is very contextual and is drawn from Professor Bardhan's remark today is the idea that political economy plays a very important role. And today, India is very much concerned about the global political economy. And it's not only the political economy and class relations of internal system, because all this RTA, FTA, and everything are very much dependent on India's strategic position vis-a-vis China and Asia. So it's very difficult to actually pin down everything to right kind of optimal conditions. And we need to only explore and learn gradually as to how we move up along the learning curve about the behavior of the government. So thank you very much. And thanks a lot, Professor Bardhan, for such a fascinating lecture. I understand the students must have gathered a lot of inputs, and that will definitely enlighten us for our future work.
May I request Professor Marjit to please felicitate Professor Bardhan? Yes, sir. May I now invite Professor Jaideep Mukherjee, Head Economics Division Delhi and convener of this conference, to present a token memento to Professor Sugata Marjit. So this ends this session of ours. We'll now proceed towards the atrium for a tea break. And soon after, the policy forum will be has been organized in old conference hall. So we may actually proceed to the old conference hall after the tea for the policy forum.